Well, we are back with another season of Leadville Trail 100 Obsession. And we are happy to say that Shimano has agreed to supporting this hyper-focused show once again. Shimano has made some news since we last spoke, and it's in the world of off-road.
Yep, Shimano has upgraded its much-loved gravel group set to 12-speed. The update brings GRX in line with Shimano's 12 cogs in its road and its mountain lineups. And while the world has gone mad for electronic shifting, Shimano decided in gravel to serve the people who like to keep it simple. And it's launched 12-speed GRX with mechanical shifting first.
Yep, good old cable actuation, still my favorite. In the new GRX lineup, riders can get their gravel on with a 1x or 2x setup. And here's why. If your terrain is climby and mountain bikey, then the 1x setup is going to be your thing. But if your gravel riding has stretches of tarmac or fast, smooth dirt, then the 2x might be the better choice.
And that's one reason we love Shimano: options. Shimano believes that there's no one way to tell all riders how to set up their shifting, and that is one reason they've stuck by 2x, even with its mountain groupos. To check out all the ways to shift a bike, 1x, 2x, mechanical, and electronic, head over to bike.shimano.com. And thanks again to Shimano for being the title sponsor of this show.
3, 2, 1.
Leadville, the podcast for the 100-mile mountain bike race, presented by Shimano. This is Season 7, Episode 1 of the show that breaks down, builds up, gets you ready, and freaks you out for the highest, hardest one-day mountain bike race in the country. I'm Michael Houghton, Hottie to most.
And I am Fatty, and like a lot of our listeners, I got word from the Leadville Race Series that I am in for 2024. I'm going to be doing the Leadville Trail 100 for my 27th start, hopefully my 26th finish. And I'm going to be starting, like I always do, with some base testing. TrainerRoad tells me my FTP is currently 255, which puts my watts per kilogram right around 3.3, which is not where I personally want to be on race day. But we're recording in January, so I don't feel too bad about it. And at least I know where I stand and the progress that I need to make.
And to help Fatty and all our listeners with how to test, we have on the show TrainerRoad coach Jonathan Lee. JL has been a regular on the show, helping our racers with training plans and race goals. And he's a Leadviller himself, so we look forward to talking to him about ramp tests and 20-minute testing, VO2 max, and the rest.
And here comes Eldon Nelson with 14 minutes to spare on that clock. The bragging rights and the heavy hardware. That's all you. Welcome back to your Leadville family and your finish line.
We are starting with something new this year that you should hear on most episodes, and that is Fatty's Finishing Tips, a nugget of info that will help you reach that red carpet.
Yep, these are mostly going to be things I've learned by doing something wrong at some point or other, as I do exactly what our listeners do: finish this race as best as I can. My first finishing tip is actually for the end of the race, or not quite at the end of the race, and that is the whole problem. It's more of a tip that you should start using about 92 miles into this race. Hottie, do you know what happens at mile 92?
Well, I think the odometer tells me that's the Carter Summit Neutral Aid Station, your last chance to get fluid, I should say. And you might be saying it just that way. Can I have some fluid? Because you're going to be about that wasted. It's just 13 miles from the finish line at that point.
Yeah, 13 short miles. That sounds like it is so close, and it is a big deal. It's a special moment for anyone because it means the end of Hottie's most hated part of the race, that turquoise lake road paved climbs, 3 miles that feels more like 1,000.
At least you can kind of smell the finish line from there.
Yeah. You have just after this maybe a half mile or so of climbing, and then it's the descent down to St. Kevin's. You hit the dirt and the paved flats, you blast down the gutter, and then it is the boulevard to the finish.
And you really do get a rush of energy, just knowing you're so close at that point.
Yeah, and actually that's where my tip comes in, Hottie, and it is a mistake I have made more than once. Most folks grab a sip of Coke or a gel or something at Carter's. And after that, the tendency is to really start smelling the barn. You feel like you are so close to the finish line and you are so sick of sucking down gel after gel. And at by the time you get to the bottom of Keevens, your GPS chimes at you and it says, time to eat again. There's a little voice in your head and it says, nah, I'm almost to the finish line. And I hate gels. I hate every gel in the world. There is no way I'm going to eat yet one more gel when I am so close to the finish line. I swear, Hottie, I've said this to myself. I've heard other people talk about this as saying the same thing to themselves. And the tip is you've got to be ready for the thought that you don't need one more gel or one more sip of whatever power energy drink you are drinking or one more chew this close to the finish line. You've got to ignore that voice and eat them anyway.
Yeah, it's true. We've heard listeners tell us this before, too, about bonking at the bottom of Keevens. That's a terrible spot to really come unglued, or on the pavement connector to the gutter. And of course, with 100+ miles in your legs, the boulevard is no joke.
No, it's not. This race finishes with a climb. So you've got to keep eating gels. You've got to stay on your nutrition plan so you don't fade literally at the end of the race. You're going to hate eating them. Guarantee 10, 11, 12 hours into this race, it is no fun to keep eating. But trust me, you will hate bonking even more.
Mm-hmm. Now, we know where the finish line is, 6th and Harrison, but what will be the food and drink finish line for you?
I actually do have a place, and it's a place of celebration. I have lots of celebration places in this race. It's on the boulevard as I cross the second train track. Most people don't realize that. There are 2 train tracks that you cross in this race. After that point, the climb eases off, and honestly, nothing you eat after that point is going to hit your bloodstream before you cross the finish line. But the key thing is I have continued to eat and drink in this race well after the 100-mile mark. The Leadville 100 ends with a climb, as we said. And if you were riding on empty, you were tempting fate by going hungry. Don't do it.
As a bonus tip, you've got to train yourself to be able to eat this many carbs this often for so long. So as you do your big training rides, do the same thing Fatty's saying here. Don't stop eating even when you know you're just a half hour from the end of your ride. Keep eating right to the end of that ride.
Yep. Your long training rides you are training your stomach, not just your legs, not just your lungs. I hear way more often about people whose race ended badly because of GI or just unable to choke down yet one more gel than for any other reason. It's a eating contest disguised as a race. We've said it a million times. And that contest does not end at Carter, even though you want it to be over then. It ends at the finish line.
All right, a couple things we want to hit early in this season, and that would be your clothing and your wheels. I know, it sounds totally unrelated, but if you're stuck indoors, then this is something you can get started on now.
Yes, let's start with the clothing part. A great way is to add some motivation to your Leadville season by having a custom kit to train and race in. DNA Cycling is the place to go for that. They've got all the tools you need to come up with the design concept that fits your style and your Leadville goals. Plus, they have outstanding jerseys and bibs that match the demands of the kind of training and racing you're going to be doing.
And if you're not the creative type and you need a little help with the design thing, then DNA has experts on hand to get your custom kit going. What you do need is lead time, and that's why we are harping on this now. Custom kits can take, 6 weeks? So best to get started on them early so you have time to ride in them first. Race day will be here faster than you think, so get on that DNA site for your custom Leadville look. Just go to dnacycling.com to learn more, and be sure to tell them the Leadville podcast sent you.
The other area we want to encourage you to start looking at now is new wheels. If you know you're going to need them, now's the time to start hitting the NV website. I personally am building my dream bike to race this year, and you can bet the first thing I bought for my Firefly is a set of M525s. They're light, they're fast, they are strong, amazing ride quality. It makes them NV's top-of-the-line cross-country wheel a perfect choice for the race across the sky.
We say get on it now because, as we know, weird things can happen in the bike industry. Companies can get swamped with orders. Supply chains can get disrupted. So it's best to act sooner rather than later. Thankfully, Envy builds their wheels in-house. So that's one huge thing they have in their control. No overseas manufacturing issues. But their work does rely on outside sources, so we never want to take product availability for granted.
No, that is a mistake we used to make. We don't make it anymore. In addition to wheels, we might as well add bars, stems, seat posts to that get them now rather than later list. Envy makes all of those too, and they make a lineup that is truly Leadville worthy. In fact, with bars, you have two great choices to choose from, the M5 and the M6. The M5 is perfect if you prefer a lower upper body, and M6 if you like your bars wide or want a little extra rise, like me.
Yep, two great options. So the clock is ticking. Get on over to the Envy site and put your order in now, and know that you will have your carbon wheels and components needs filled in time for race season. Head to Envy, that's ENVE.com.
Your trip to the red carpet has to start somewhere. Yeah, you got to get into the race. But once you're in, then what? Well, then you have to make a plan. And a lot of that plan is going to revolve around training. And a training plan almost always starts with testing.
Yeah, that's right, Fatty. We need a baseline, a jumping off point, so we know where we are and where we need to go. Now, there are a bunch of ways to figure out current fitness. The question is, what is best for you? To help us answer that, we turn to a reliable source in TrainerRoad coach Jonathan Lee. Jonathan helps us break down the various ways to find our fitness level and what to do with that info. From ramp to 20-minute to VO2 max to AI testing. We discuss the pros and cons of each and get you on your way to your Leadville goal. So one of the things we're going to talk about with Jonathan today, the thing we're going to talk about with Jonathan today is how we get to the numbers we want to work at, which would mean testing. And this is the beginning of the season as we get prepared for the Leadville Trail 100. Hopefully all you folks got confirmation that you're in the race one way or another. And even if you're not, I mean, if you're not and you're planning for the next year, this is a good spot to begin. So when you do get in, you know exactly how to push off and get ready. And that's generally going to start with some type of testing. Like you want to know where you are physiologically and how you need to proceed forward. So what we're going to talk about with Jonathan is the various ways all the ways you can test. Well, not all the ways, but most of the popular ways you can test. So Jonathan, let's just tackle all of these primary methods that we've heard of. We're going to start with a popular one and one that I heard first a lot about on TrainerRoad. I know you've moved on from it. That is the 20-minute FTP test. Tell us about this test and the pros and cons of it.
Yeah, so we haven't moved on from it, and the fact that you can still do a 20-minute FTP test with TrainerRoad if that's what you like. It's really good for athletes that are very skilled at pacing. If I'm going to do a FTP test protocol, I actually prefer the 1x20 FTP test. That's my personal one that I like. I've developed an ability to be able to pace myself extremely well and to be able to hold something because, once again, training with power for so long, I'm like really well calibrated to know what something feels like and to know what my threshold feels like, or just above, just below. The tricky part is pacing with this one, though. It's 20 minutes. And the point is, with an FTP test like this, your power should not vary widely at any point during that effort. You're basically trying to throw a dart at the wall and hit this really difficult spot to hit. It's like hitting a bullseye. And that bullseye represents above your threshold because you're riding for 20 minutes, but it's to the point where you'll explode at 20 minutes and 1 second, but not any time before that. So it's like trying to find that pace where it feels pretty hard in the beginning and then it just gets progressively harder to maintain. And what we've seen with athletes with the 20-minute test is largely it just ends up making them enter a situation where they are either underestimating their FTP or they do something crazy where they like surge at the end and they, for the final 5 minutes or something, they kind of sandbag it and they ride sweet spot for a while and then they just surge like crazy. And sometimes that can throw off average power metrics. And as a result, you could even like theoretically overestimate with it. So it's just really hard. I don't know many athletes, relatively speaking, I don't know many athletes that can nail a 1x20 FTP test and do well, much less something like going out for an hour and holding your power steady for an hour. I mean, if you have a trainer, you can do that. Very rare are the climbs in the world where you can have just like a steady, Mount Lemmon comes to mind down in Tucson. But other than that, it's pretty tough to find an hour-long climb like that.
I will say that apart from important races, the 20-minute FTP test is the only thing that has ever made me lose sleep before a ride.
It's daunting.
For years and years, I put a lot of emotional personal stock in what my FTP is. And the 20-minute test that I did basically once a quarter was basically me assessing my value as a person. And I know I'm not the only person who is like that.
We need to talk about that really quick, though, because with all these testing methods, whatever we do, remember the use of FTP here. FTP, despite what our type A competitive brains tell us, does not define us as an athlete. It's very important that you understand the fact that it is a training benchmark used for prescribing your training. And you can also use it for pacing and guiding your pacing in a race. But it does not represent you as an athlete. That's just simply, it's quite difficult to detach that because just as you said there, Eldon, I've done the same thing so many times where I'm entirely defining myself by my FTP. But over the years, I've gotten to the point where I'm just happy it's accurate. If it's 270 or if it's 320, I'm just happy it is accurate. That's all I care about because then I know I'm going to get the right training. Because if you're training at too high of an FTP, you are going to have subpar training, certainly subpar recovery in between your training because you're just going to be working too hard for what you can sustain. So I think it's really important to talk about that part there and recognize the fact that on the day, yes, your FTP is very important and a larger FTP solves basically any problem on a bike. I understand that. But within a realm of reality that we all exist, we can't just have a Filippo Ganna 500 watt FTP tomorrow if we'd like that. Instead, we have to chip away at it, and it becomes the sum of the work that we've done. So rather looking at it as the sum of you as a person, just remember that it's the sum of the work that's been done. Life has allowed you a certain set of circumstances to train as you have, and that's what it is.
So the 20-minute FTP test, you warm up, you do that 20-minute effort, you want to explode at 20 minutes in a second. And then how do you calculate your FTP coming out of that test? What is it? Was it a percentage of that 20-minute segment?
Yeah, it's 95% of your average power for that 20-minute interval. And typically beforehand, what you'll do is you'll do some sort of a clearing effort beforehand. And those clearing efforts are basically meant to exhaust a little bit of your anaerobic work capacity that you might have. So then that way we get a better measure of your aerobic capabilities. I'm somebody with very high anaerobic work capacity. And I have this, it contributes a lot to what I can do on the bike in aerobic efforts. And any sort of spikes or anything else, I'm the sort of person that would like to spike and do hard efforts and punch over and over. That's just how I'm built. And it's important that you tire those fibers out just a touch. So that's why you'll see, and it depends. Some people do like very short, hard 30-second efforts and a handful of those. Some people do like a 3 or a 5-minute effort that's above your threshold, a VO2 style effort beforehand, and then you recover from that. And once you feel ready to go, then you start the 20. But that's the point, is to measure aerobic capacity there with that. So.
Okay, so we've more or less figured that's not necessarily the best way to go if you have not invested a lot of time at becoming good at it. It is more of a measurement of how experienced are you at metering out effort for 20 minutes? What are better approaches?
This is a very similar approach, but it's an option that you can do that can be a bit easier for people because 20 minutes is very long. 8 minutes is shorter. So there is the 2x8 minute test. Now you have to do it twice. So you end up doing 16 minutes of this work instead of 20 minutes. Yes, it's less, but it has to be harder. So the way the 2x8 minute test is you go out and you do an 8-minute effort. And again, you're doing the same thing. You're trying to throw that dart and hit the bullseye where you can ride at whatever stable power for 8 minutes will completely explode you at 8 minutes and 1 second. And the first and the second one, you have to go all out on both of them. And that's why I think actually the 2x8 is even harder for a lot of athletes, is because it's easy to go out too hard, perhaps. Although I'd argue that that's just not a well-paced effort, because again, if you hit the bullseye, you'll blow up at the end, and that is what it is. But it's just really tough to get up the gumption to do that again. And with this one, what you do, and there's different approaches with this, you either average both intervals together and you take 90% of whatever that average is, and that's average power for those intervals, or you take it on the second interval. A lot of coaches do that on the second one. They'll do that, or they'll do some sort of like weighted distribution thing where basically like if there's a deviation from one to the next that's greater than this, then take that one. So, but basically what you do is you do that same sort of hard paced effort, but even harder. You're like in VO2 territory, basically. Like you're at just below those VO2 max, those low VO2 max intervals, an extremely uncomfortable place to dwell. And you have to do it 2 times for 8 minutes each. It's a really tough one. And this one we see there's even more opportunity for that like anaerobic work capacity to come in, and that contribution to be able to throw things off a bit and maybe cause you to overtest. But this is also the one where you see people maybe do well on the first one, then completely explode and not be able to do the second one. This one I think is honestly no less difficult. Perhaps it's less mentally daunting than 20 minutes nonstop, but it's no less difficult to get an accurate testing benchmark. And it's been a huge frustration point for us. And if I can, like, I think I want to explain something. So at TrainerRoad, like we are just focused on trying to find the best way to make people faster. And our assumption is that we don't know whatever that is right now. Like whatever we've done in the past can exist and we should learn from that. But wherever we go in the forward isn't necessarily just a continuation of what we've done in the past, but like, we want to learn what that is. So we look at data a lot of the time. And when you look at these test results, like for us, Aaron, when you just look at training data in general, athletes that are more consistent get faster. Overwhelmingly, you can compare one training plan to another, a person that does 30 VO2 workouts instead of 5-minute VO2 intervals or something else. And it's just the ones that are consistent get faster. So for us, like we're just trying to make people more consistent and design tools with artificial intelligence that are designed to do that. And when it came to testing, it was really interesting because we looked at 20-minute tests, 2x8-minute tests, and then ramp tests, which I'll get into in just a second. But all these testing formats, what you found is that there was a core group of people that really were good at 20-minute FTP tests, but the vast majority were really bad. And then the same thing with the 2x8. And it just delivered bad training results that made their training inconsistent. So ramp test protocols are really common across the board. And we brought in a ramp test protocol that we felt was simplified. Instead of doing 3-minute steps or 2-minute steps, that was really difficult. We did a huge amount of testing, probably more testing, honestly, than like the 1x20 or 2x8, because those were just kind of like, we had godfathers of power with like Joe Friel, Andy Coggan, and they were just like, this is good. And it is theoretically good, but practically very difficult to execute those tests. So with this ramp test, we tested it, I believe in the beginning, it was over 8,000 athletes. And what we did is we then measured their subsequent workouts for compliance to look to see if they had higher compliance scores and the workouts were appropriately difficult afterward. And the ramp test improved that for a lot of athletes, which is really cool. But that one is you step up from 40 or 50% FTP every minute, you step up a handful of watts. It's going to be like, somewhere around 10 to 20 watts, depending on your FTP. And you go to exhaustion. And then what that does is it uses math based on your highest 1-minute power within that ramp test, whatever that is, to figure that out. And it does some cool stuff. If you completely blow the pacing plan, it can still kind of figure it out. But ramp tests, for me personally, are the most daunting, way more daunting than a 20-minute test, because you have to go so deep on a ramp test. Like, so hard, and it just keeps ramping up. And whenever you feel like you're like, I can't do it anymore, it's like, okay, actually I've got 6 more minutes of ramping up before I can really get to that point. And that one's really, really tough. And for some athletes, it does not work, and they can't get that out of themselves.
So the ramp test just keeps clicking up the power, correct? You're in erg mode essentially when you're executing this test, and it just keeps adding more resistance until you fail?
Yes.
You have to reach failure, correct? And then how does your FTP get calculated out of that?
With TrainerRoad, what we do is we look at the highest 1 minute power from that, and then we run math on that 1 minute power. And then that math gives us a reduction from that. And the instant thing people think is like, well, that's going to just be measuring my anaerobic power because it's super high, right? So that is inaccurate. But the math that we developed behind it, we looked at all this, and then, like I said, we tested on over 8,000 different athletes before we launched it. So that's a huge testing pool, like way more than most studies and everything else. We used the appropriate math so that we could actually get, and on repeated sort of experiments and everything else, we could actually get to the point where athletes were getting an accurate FTP from that. So it did improve, like, if you're looking for FTPs that deliver people better training, the ramp test does, for most people, deliver better results than the 2x8 or the 1x20. But it still is not, it's certainly not fail-proof at all.
Yeah, and it's just daunting as hell. Like, as a time trialist, I had no problem executing a 20-minute test. My results were they would fluctuate, just based on how I was feeling that day. The 2x8 is another one I had no problem dealing with. That ramp test, that thing was awful. I mean, I just never got that thing. So
Lisa was the same way. She hates the ramp test. I love the ramp test. It's just the agony of the ramp test really draws me. It's the same thing that I love about Columbine or the power line, right? It is just the intensity. Am I at my limit, or do I have something more? I mean, there is a game aspect to the ramp test that really draws me. Lisa hates it, and she will routinely fail way before her FTP actually is, and she'll be like, "No, that's not it," and she'll go on to TrainerRoad and be like, "Click, click, 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 click. Okay, I'm putting it where I know my FTP really is." So yeah, it's there. It tests a kind of a appetite for pain is what it tests. Is my experience with it. Now, I haven't done any of these in quite a while because lately I have been just letting TrainerRoad say, "Hey, I've adjusted your FTP for you," and it's moved it up and down as I just do my training rides. And so that is your AI that is doing this. Lately, it's been adjusting down for me, which I'm eating some humble pie. But I also know that it is not lying, right? I mean, it is December as we are recording right now, and my FTP definitely is down from September. So, I mean, it's giving me some honest results. Tell us a little bit about how this works.
Yeah, like from the perspective of us trying to find the best way to make people faster, testing was one of the biggest obstacles. No matter how complicated or nuanced or simplified you tried to design a testing protocol, testing is hard. And it's going to be, like Eldon just said, good for one person, not for another, depending on the format. Testing anxiety is always wrapped into that. And for a lot of people, that means that a test day is the worst day of the entire year. And as a result, it's really tough for them to be able to get the most out of themselves. So we wanted to fix this. It's been for 12 years now, we've been building up and trying to organize all of the data that we have, the training data, which is over 250 million workouts, whether that's inside or outside from athletes, rides. And a subset of that, 25 million of that, is TrainerRoad workouts that are really structured. And we knew that a person was supposed to be doing this at any second, and this is what they did. And that's allowed us to have this kind of like true north to measure against. Not to say that like these sort of training plans make people faster, these sort of workouts, not that, but rather just to train these machine learning and artificial intelligence models so that they can understand how people improve and find different signs of improvement. And now what we've been able to do is create these models that recognize when your FTP changes. And the coolest part is you could theoretically just ride endurance, never break out of your zone 2. And you could, but if you were doing a ton of that and it was raising your FTP because it's aerobic work, AI FTP detection recognizes that. And it doesn't just look at your inside workouts, it looks at your outside rides. It looks at that race that you did. And when you did these crazy hard efforts, it also understands that in the sense that it knows that that's, if you did a really hard 8-minute effort, it knows that that's not your new FTP, for example. And it doesn't just look for things like a lot of other existing products out there. Like you go and you do like a 20-minute effort and it's hard and it's like, here's your new FTP. When in reality, Like you were just cruising up that climb and you weren't going as hard as you can. And even though you're at 250 watts, 180 watts is not your new FTP, despite what that, what that effort looks like. So this is using models to understand how people perform, understand how you as an individual perform, and how you've grown in the past. And then it uses all that, looks at what you're doing currently, and it's able to say, Eldon is actually right here, right now. And it's been crazy because, well, again, our whole goal is to improve like the quality of your workouts and the subsequent workouts. And it's 38. So based on the data and the outcomes from this, AI FTP detection is 38% less likely to overestimate your FTP versus the 20-minute test. So that means that if you are a person that overestimates with that test, this is 38% less likely to do that. It's 75% less likely to underestimate your FTP versus the 20-minute test. Again, that's way more common, right? Where people have like the underestimation issue with that 20-minute effort because it's really hard to do. 40% less likely to underestimate your FTP versus the ramp test as well. So all these things, it's just allowed us to be able to make training so much more consistent with people. And we validated this with over 22,000 athletes over the course of 9 months and did tweaking and everything else. And it was so cool because most of those athletes didn't go out and do an all-out effort. They never needed to do a 20-minute, an 8-minute, or a ramp. Yet it was still giving them higher quality training all along and adjusting it for them. It's amazing. Death to testing. Testing is the worst, and you don't have to worry about it, especially these like really complicated protocols. And it's like, go out and do 5 minutes, then do 1 minute, then do 30 seconds, then do 20 minutes, then do this. And those things are just really rough, mentally speaking, and then also physically to get the most out of yourself. And isn't it just nice when you can just train and you don't have to sacrifice your training day and you can just have something do it for you? That's how I want to do it. I have terrible testing anxiety. So this has improved my quality of life substantially. Yeah, it's pretty great.
Hottie, since testing is the theme of this show, let's talk about another form of testing you and I have prescribed many times over 6 seasons of this show, and that is testing fuel and hydration products. Drink mixes and gels, bars and chews. Now is the time to start figuring out what works for you by testing, and you can find a variety of products to try on at the feed.
Now, we say for your FTP tests, like we're talking about in this show, go with something you know so as to not foul up the test with GI disturbance. But once you are off and running with your training schedule, start trying foods and drinks to see what works and what does not.
Last season, I was very intrigued by the new Scratch Super High Carb Drink Mix Dr. Alan Lim told us about on the show, but it was a little too late in the game to start experimenting with it. So I put it on hold, but now is the time of year when I can start working a drink like that into my nutrition plan. I start by using it during some trainer sessions, and then if I like it, I'll take it to the trails.
Yeah, that's a great plan. Your fuel and hydration plan should be a process of elimination. There are a ton of products out there, and the feed has most of them. But not all of them will be good on your gut. So start testing now when a puke or an unexpected pee stop doesn't kill your race.
Yeah, do things early. Claim your $80 credit at thefeed.com/Leadville. Register your email, verify your phone number, and then make sure you spend your first feed credit of $20 right away.
All right, this is our testing 1, 2, 3 show. TrainerRoad coach Jonathan Lee is here to help us nail our FTP. I believe I've done all the testing methods we're talking about here today. AI FTP to a lesser degree because I haven't done the TrainerRoad one, but I've done the other ones you talked about, Jonathan. Like, I know Training Peaks has got one. Garmin will throw up a new, an automatic FTP number for you as you progress. One of the first tests I ever did was in a lab, though, and it was VO2 max. Put on a mask, get on a CompuTrainer. There's a tech there running things. What are your thoughts on VO2 max testing? And I'm going to have a follow-up, too, with another in-lab type of testing. So VO2 max, tell us what that's about and the pros and cons of it.
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, and this is the goal with training in general, you're trying to train your body to be able to utilize the most amount of oxygen possible because that allows you to do more work. We need oxygen to be able to do aerobic exercise, right? Our muscles need that. That's the main fuel that it's using there. And a VO2 max test measures that. It measures your body's ability to take in oxygen and then utilize that oxygen. And what it does is it measures a gas exchange. So it's basically what's coming in versus what's coming out. And then it's able to figure out how much oxygen you're utilizing. It's then normalized to your weight. So then that way, Hottie, you're a tall guy. Eldon's somebody shorter, you might actually use much more oxygen than Eldon, right? But that doesn't mean that you are, much more fit than him in terms of your performance as an athlete. It's normalized to weight. So then that way it's figured out. And commonly you'll hear of like VO2 max figures of if you're above 60, then you're athletic. And if you're above 70, you're an elite athlete. And we hear these incredible tales of athletes scoring even as high as 98. Which is crazy. And then we hear stories of like Mark Cavendish, who I believe is like a 50, and he's never been necessarily high. Certainly hasn't stopped Mark Cavendish from having one of the best careers ever in cycling. So VO2 max is a measure of your body's ability to uptake, process, utilize that oxygen. And it's highly irrelevant to how you would prescribe training because of the fact that you can't measure your VO2 max all the time when you're out on the bike. So I can't tell you to go ride at 30 liters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight and go do that, right? Because you have no way of measuring that. It's kind of like a cool thing to measure, like you're just measuring your height on a wall sort of a thing. And absolutely, if you're doing that, it is going to turn into a self-worth thing. So I caution against doing that. And I don't think that it's necessarily helpful for a lot of athletes to do. It can be informative in some regards. You can see if you have a high or a low VO2 max, I guess, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because what you do with all of that and how you perform on the bike, you can perform in different ways even if you have a high or a low VO2 max.
Yeah, well, what it requires is you have to go back into the lab and test again and pay for that testing each time you go in.
And if you want a new high score, you have to be in peak form. At a very low weight for you, and you have to be operating very, at your highest levels. So if you do it in the off season, you're going to get a much lower VO2 max score for yourself. So it varies in that regard too. It's not like Eldon is forever, a 67 VO2 max. That's not the case.
What was discovered, at least for me when I did it the first time, is the person running the test said, look, you need to spend more time, working on your mitochondria. On developing your aerobic system because you're scoring too low here, which was helpful. In fact, I went out and that off season really focused on keeping it chill, but riding longer, slow distance rides. And I became a better aerobic athlete because of it. But I never really did much follow-up testing with that because, again, lab expense, fine. This was back in the day when heart rate monitors were the thing.
Stepping back even further on that really quick, Hottie, because that's an important thing. If you had not done that test, you still would have gone out and trained and done a lot of aerobic training.
I not so much. I was doing a lot of group rides and going way too hard in the off season is what I was doing. Yeah, and it was hampering my development as an athlete at the time. So I do owe VO2 max at least that much.
The key with that, because this is super important. People are going to hear that and think, well, shoot, I need a VO2 max test so I can be like Hottie and then know exactly what I need to do. You weren't prescribed a specific type of anything else. And the key is, if you want to improve your mitochondrial function in terms of producing more power and being able to do that aerobically, structured training. Like there's so many different ways to skin the cat. You don't have to go and do a bunch of low intensity stuff. You just have to do something that is designed to not overwork you. If you are doing a bunch of group rides and everything else, you're really working that glycolytic system really hard. That's that high intensity stuff. If you're just going out and just hammering or punching away and just doing hard stuff all the time, yes, you are not going to make yourself more aerobically efficient. You will, just not to the degree that really you probably need, especially for a day like Leadville. So the tricky part is what I'm getting at there is VO2 max gives you no additional information about a prescription that's necessarily going to be unique that you would not get with any other structured training plan from a coach or anything else. They would still work you and try to improve your aerobic efficiency. That's kind of how it all goes.
Blood lactate testing is another one I've done. A lot of fun, folks. You sit on a trainer and somebody pricks your finger occasionally and reads what's in your blood. Tell us about blood lactate testing, Jonathan, pros and cons of that situation.
Oh, I'm going to catch a lot of flack for this one. This will be controversial, but
okay.
I think that blood lactate testing is misunderstood largely, and it's also misrepresented very frequently. again, how VO2 max is fluid and it will change with training and with detraining, your lactate measurements also change. There's this theory that you have like, your 2 to 4 millimole is where your lactate threshold is where it exists, and that's what it is. And that simply is not true. If you eat a bowl of oatmeal with a bunch of berries beforehand, and then the next day you just eat sausage and eggs, you're going to have very different lactate figures. More sugar in the blood system is going to end up producing more lactate within your blood. And when you are burning more sugar like that, yes, it also produces more lactate. But then you could be like myself. I don't hit my threshold until I'm at like 12 millimolar per liter, which is huge. Like most people don't even hit that peak. And I like idle at people's typical threshold. That's just the way I'm built. I don't know why. After doing many different lactate tests. And that doesn't mean anything in terms of whether I'm a better athlete or worse athlete. The fact is I can produce and reprocess and tolerate a lot of lactate, but that doesn't mean that I can go harder than somebody up a hill. Like, it's just that I have a different thing in my blood, and that's what it is. So it's commonly misunderstood. And it's just some quick myth busting on this. Lactate doesn't cause burn. It does not. You create an acidic environment in your blood because every time that thinking of it like a car, if you had a car, it produces exhaust fumes. And that exhaust fumes, we can't use that. It just goes into the air and it pollutes the air, right? Well, the cool thing about our bodies is we have like a hose over the exhaust pipe, and then it goes back into our fuel tank. And turns out exhaust is like jet fuel. It's awesome fuel for our bodies. And that's what lactate is. Anytime that we are working our muscles and we're using sugar of some form and oxygen to be able to create energy, we get lactate as a byproduct. But our body can reprocess and utilize that byproduct as jet fuel. It's awesome energy for us. But every time we do that, there's an equation that happens, and just like terrible long division, there's a remainder that's left. And that remainder is hydrogen. So as you start to have more of those equations happening in your body, as you produce more and more lactate and you're reprocessing it, there's more and more remainders. They just pile up, and more hydrogen atoms within the presence of our blood, or ions, forgive me, that ends up creating that acidic environment that we have. So that acidic environment, we assume, is what causes the burn. But even then, theoretically, we don't really know. Science hasn't told us that, yes, indeed, this is the burn. A lot of people opine that it's a mental, it's a neurocontrolled thing, and it's actually like a protection mechanism that we have. But in the end, it doesn't cause the burn. The other issue with lactate testing is it's extremely inconvenient and difficult to get accurate readings unless you're in a laboratory environment. You'll see the Norwegian training method referenced very commonly in the triathlon world, and they've popularized using lactate testing at the beginning and end of every single interval and doing all this stuff. And if you listen to some of the great coaches, they aren't prescribing coaching or their training by that. They're using it to inform themselves as another data point, but it isn't actually lining out exactly what you do. So yes, it can be very helpful in finding what your true lactate threshold is. And that is a really important thing for a lot of athletes to be able to figure out. And with traditional testing methods of like 1x20, 2x8, and ramp tests, it's very difficult, as we just discussed, for athletes to find out what their lactate threshold is. But that's what we've designed AI-FTP detection to do, to try to combat that, to make the results of a lactate test that's well executed in a good environment, make it so that you can get that sort of result, but then get it without having to do all the hassle. It can be certainly interesting. And once again, this changes a ton with training, though. Also, if you're training for Leadville and that sort of thing, your lactate threshold, when you come up to 10,000 feet of elevation and it's race day and it's a very different environment, it's not as relevant in terms of if you were taking blood lactate data all throughout that race, that wouldn't necessarily, it'd be very difficult to be able to tie that down and kind of like understand how it relates to the other data that you've been getting not at 10,000 feet as well. So yeah, I mean, it's complicated. It can give you a lactate threshold measurement that is likely going to be, it is going to be much more accurate than you can get from a 4 or 2x20 or 1x20, 2x8 or a ramp test. But man, it's complicated. So
like the VO2 max, you're generally on a trainer in a lab setting, as opposed to having a mask on and monitoring the exchange of gases going in and out of you. They're monitoring your blood. They're periodically taking a look at your blood while increasing the resistance on the trainer to see what's happening. And then out of at least blood lactate, Jonathan, I understand you can get zones, I believe, because when I did it, I got zones. And you can also get a look at how you're using calories?
I mean, yes. I mean, you could look at your, basically, if you're looking at any test like this, you can understand how you're using calories. Gas exchange tests are going to give you a better indication, though, like a VO2 max style test. But you can do a gas exchange test to figure out how much fat versus sugar that you're burning at any point as well. And then that way you can get a good indication of where you're at. But a good proxy for that is, are you able to do those? Do you have a lot of aerobic fitness? If you do, your body's going to be efficiently using sugar, sparing it a bit, right? Not dipping into it just to be able to do relatively easy efforts. So there's a lot of complicated ways to arrive at the same conclusion that you get with just a coach giving you a really good plan, and in the end, that's kind of the easier thing. And one other key thing, and kind of like a myth with lactate, is that it's this live representation of work, but it's not. It's a lagging indicator, just like heart rate. You go out and if you had like 30/30s, like 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off with heart rate, that's impossible to do, right? Because it takes 20 seconds for your heart rate to even react to that effort. And then after that, it stays elevated when you're resting. And lactate is as well a lagging indicator of what you're actually doing, the power you're creating on the bike as well. So it takes a while for that lactate to build up and then to clear at different rates and all that stuff. So, but you can get zones. You can figure out how your body is what substrates your body's using to create power at any point with gas exchange tests. But in the end, man, they're all just really complicated ways to be able to make you faster. And that making you faster is largely through aerobic training that's just well structured,
So I'm thinking about our listener and, frankly, about us ourselves. And typical listener is man or woman in their 40s doing this race for, first, second, third time. What tests are going to actually give them value? And what should they do once they have a number?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you are, because Eldon, I think that a lot of your athletes, they don't use power, but then they don't have power on their mountain bike or something else that they primarily are going to use, right, for Leadville. I honestly think RPE is very underrated for a lot of athletes. Like if you don't have power and you don't have access to that stuff, you go out and you can use things like your ventilatory thresholds to be able to train. VT1 or your ventilatory threshold 1. I'm not going to say that anymore because I'm going to trip over that for sure. I'll just call it VT1 and VT2. At VT1, that's like below that, you can have an easy, comfortable conversation with somebody while you're riding. When you go beyond that, that's when you're having to squeeze in words in between. Like you're thinking about where you place your words in relation to your breaths, right? And then anything above VT2, that's when you really do not want to talk or you're not able to talk, right? And simple things to guide you like that are so effective. In the end, in many cases, it's just as effective as going into a lab to figure out where your threshold is and doing blood lactate testing, is you can figure that stuff out with just VT1 and VT2 and to be able to do that. So if an athlete goes out and ride for a while at below VT1, and then after that, step into that zone in between VT1 and VT2 and just slowly ramp up until you get to the point where you do not want to talk anymore. That's probably where your threshold is. And then at that point, you can kind of figure out, okay, I know what that felt like, and you can use that to guide your training in the most simple way, and then you can say, I'm going to do, my threshold days are going to be riding at that spot. My VO2 day is going to be riding above that. And then, the rest of the days that I'll be doing are going to be below, where I can have that conversational pace or maybe just squeezing words in between at different points. So I think that's kind of like the most simplified way.
VT1, what does that stand for? VT1, VT2?
Oh, you're making me say it again. Ventilatory threshold 1 and ventilatory threshold 2. In other words, your breathing thresholds that you have. They're remarkably accurate to represent your body's ability to, or I guess the different crossover points that your body has, or in other words, thresholds. So
I can know those. I know where I am with that without having any idea what my FTP is. So do I need to know my FTP?
If you want to follow a structured plan that's going to be giving you power-based prescriptions, then yes. And that's the best way to train. Because of the fact that different things change on different days and you never know exactly if you're riding at the right power or not, yeah, power is the best way to train.
And that's how you know you're improving or falling back, right?
Because as whatever, everyone credits it to Greg LeMond, but who knows who said this at this point? Eddie Merckx, Lance Armstrong, who knows who? But it never gets easier. It never gets easier. You just get faster. again, if you're just using your ventilatory thresholds, you might be able to understand, oh, I'm getting up this climb faster or something like that, but you really have no indication of improvement. And that's why it's super helpful to use power. And you can, with power on pacing and everything else, especially for a race like Leadville, I just think it's so crucial to be able to have that sort of stuff there. So,
all right, Jonathan, one more thing on testing before we let you go. A lot of us wear chest straps and we monitor heart rate. Where does heart rate fit into this whole question, this whole pursuit of testing? How should we be considering it?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Again, this will probably stir up a lot of folks, but I don't think that you should make any decisions based off of it. Because in the end, it's kind of like RPM in a car. Like I can be in second gear, I can be in fifth gear. I'm still at 2,500 RPM. And I'm not sure what that really means in terms of the output that the engine is actually producing. So you can see it there, and it will also reflect thresholds, assuming similar circumstances. But the trickiest part is just that heart rate's so variable. From one day to the next, elevation, stress. We have so many different sources of stress in our lives. I'm not talking about just stress from training, but I'm also talking about the stress that it comes in through every avenue in life. Your nutrition, your caffeine intake, your everything else, your levels of psychological arousal coming into something, the opinion that you have of yourself before that effort, all these things affect your heart rate, right? So it's variable. It's interesting to watch though, and especially if you're looking at your training over time, you will notice that when you ride at 200 watts at the beginning of your training plan versus toward the end, your heart rate's probably going to be a lot lower riding at 200 watts, which is an indication, generally speaking, over time, if it's a trend, that you might be getting faster. So it's helpful, but it certainly isn't anything that I would base any decisions on.
Again, thanks to Jonathan Lee for his expertise and all the folks at TrainerRoad. We love those folks there. You've probably heard me push back a little on the lab-oriented testing. I do think there is a place for VO2 or lactate testing if you have the time and the money. Something we didn't say during that interview, Fatty, is that cross-referencing what one testing is telling you or what one test is telling you with another is not a bad idea either if you have the time and energy. And in the case of VO2 or lactate testing, the money, because it does cost extra.
Absolutely agree, Hottie. For most of us, we're just going to keep it simple, and that is going to work just fine. I will add this. If you see crazy swings in your test results, ask questions and start, as Hottie said, by cross-referencing those tests. For more discussion on the topic, head over to our Slack channel. You can get an invite code at leadville.fm/Slack.
And if you like the show, go to wherever you listen and give us a 5-star rating and write a review. And to see all the ways you can find this independent show, it is leadville.fm.
Good luck in your testing, your riding, your recovery. Thanks so much for listening, and we're going to see you sooner than you think at the starting line.